The sun was setting over the desert highway when Jake, a lone trucker, pulled into a dusty gas station with a stray dog sitting beside him in the cab. The other drivers laughed. Why waste food on a mutt? But that night, when armed men dragged Jake from his rig, it wasn't another trucker who came to his rescue. It was the dog. They thought his dog was just a useless stray until it proved them all wrong. What would you do in his place? Let us know in the comments. Like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more incredible stories. The highway stretched endlessly, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the barren desert. The sun burned hot overhead, casting waves of heat that made the horizon shimmer. Jake, a lone trucker, had been on the road for days, hauling freight across the country. But he wasn't alone. Beside him, curled up on the passenger seat, was Bandit, a stray dog he'd picked up months ago at a gas station. Back then, Bandit was nothing but skin and bones, scavenging for scraps behind the dumpsters. Jake had tossed him half a sandwich, thinking nothing of it. But when he pulled out of the lot, the mutt had chased after his truck, refusing to be left behind. Jake never planned on keeping a dog, but something about Bandit's stubbornness, his quiet loyalty struck a chord. So, he let him stay. Bandit had become more than just a stray. He was Jake's shadow, his co-pilot. And even though other truckers laughed at him for keeping the mutt around, Jake didn't care. Now, as the radio crackled with static and the tires hummed along the desolate road, Bandit sat up, ears twitching. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Jake muttered, glancing at the dog. Then he saw it. Up ahead, a group of men stood in the middle of the road. 5 of them, all dressed in dark clothes, faces wrapped in scarves to shield them from the desert dust. They were armed shotguns slung over their shoulders, pistols tucked into their belts. Bandits. Jake cursed under his breath and eased off the gas. He'd heard stories of truck hijackings along these roads, but he never thought he'd run into one himself. He wasn't the kind of man who scared easy, but 5 armed men against 1 trucker? That wasn't a fight he wanted to pick. As he slowed to a stop, one of the men stepped forward, smirking. "Afternoon, trucker," the leader said, resting a hand on his pistol. "You're carrying something valuable, aren't you?" Jake gripped the wheel tighter. "Just freight, ain't worth your trouble." The gang chuckled, exchanging knowing glances. "Oh, we'll decide that," the leader said, stepping closer to the driver's side. "Why don't you step out nice and slow?" Jake's pulse quickened. He glanced at Bandit, who was now standing, teeth bared, hackles raised. The dog sensed it too'd anger. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured. He didn't want to fight, but he wasn't about to roll over either. One of the other bandits laughed. "What's this? You got yourself a little mutt for protection?" The group erupted in laughter. One of them even kicked a rock in Bandit's direction, sneering. "What's he gonna do? Bark us to death?" Jake didn't say a word. He just looked at Bandit. The dog didn't flinch. He didn't back down. He just stared, muscles coiled like a spring. The leader's smirk faded. "Get out of the truck, old man," he snapped, pulling his pistol. "Now." Jake exhaled slowly, his fingers curling into fists. He could feel it coming, the storm before the strike. And Bandit? Bandit was ready. Jake could see it in their eyes the moment their patience ran out. The leader, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped closer, tapping his pistol against the door of Jake's truck. The sound was sharp, a warning. "I said, get out." Jake stayed still, his hands gripping the wheel. He had been in enough bad situations to know that panicking never helped. But this wasn't looking good. These weren't desperate men trying to scare him off. These were professionals, and they weren't leaving empty-handed. Bandit growled, low and steady, his body tense. The men laughed again, but this time there was an edge of irritation in their voices. "Stupid mutt," one of them muttered, shifting his rifle. "Let's just shoot the damn thing." Jake's stomach tightened. "You shoot my dog, and I swear you'll regret it." That only made them laugh harder. The leader tilted his head, smirking. "Regret it? Old man, do you see how many of us there are? You really think you're in any position to make threats?" The man beside him, a bulky guy with a shotgun, racked a shell into the chamber. "Maybe we make an example out of him. Show him we're not playing." Jake clenched his jaw. They were trying to push him, to make him desperate. If he lost his cool, they'd have all the power. He needed to buy time, to find a way out. But with 5 guns pointed at him and the truck, his options were slim. The leader's smirk faded. "Enough talking. You've got 3 seconds to step out before we drag you out." Jake took a deep breath. He wasn't afraid of a fight, but 5-on-1? That was suicide. His best shot was still in the cab, still waiting beside him, hackles raised, muscles coiled. One of the men reached for the handle of the door. That was their first mistake, because the second that door cracked open, Bandit launched himself at the man like a bolt of fury, teeth bared, jaws snapping. The man screamed, stumbling back as Bandit's teeth sank into his arm. Chaos erupted, and in that split second of confusion, Jake made his move. Jake had spent his whole life avoiding unnecessary fights. He wasn't the kind of man to go looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. And tonight, Trouble had 5 guns, bad intentions, and no clue who they were messing with. As Bandit latched onto the first man's arm, dragging him down with a pained yell, the others recoiled in shock. That hesitation was all Jake needed. With a swift motion, he kicked open the truck door, slamming it into the second man's face. The crunch of breaking cartilage was drowned out by a sharp curse as blood splattered onto the sand. The man staggered back, clutching his nose, gun slipping from his fingers. Jake wasn't done. Years of hauling freight and working the road had built up a strength most men didn't expect from him. He launched himself out of the cab, his boot connecting with the third man's gut before his feet even hit the ground. The man doubled over, wheezing, as Jake ripped the shotgun from his grasp and turned it on the leader. The laughter, the cocky grinsawl of it, vanished. Now it was just silent. Bandit stood beside Jake, teeth bared, muzzle stained red. The man he had taken down was still writhing on the ground, clutching his bleeding arm. Jake chambered around. "You were real brave a minute ago," he said, voice calm, measured. "Not laughing now, are you?" The leader's eyes darted between his crew, realizing they were no longer in control. Jake took a slow step forward. "You want to find out what happens next? Or are you smart enough to walk away?" For the first time that night, the bandits looked afraid. The gang leader, a man who had strutted with confidence just moments ago, now stood frozen, eyes darting between his wounded crew and the trucker who had just turned the tables. The laughter that once echoed through the desert night was gone, replaced by the sound of labored breathing, shifting feet, and the low, menacing growl of Bandit. Jake kept the shotgun leveled, finger resting lightly on the trigger. "You picked the wrong truck," he said, his voice steady, almost casual. "And worse, you picked the wrong dog." The man Bandit had taken down was still writhing in the dirt, his sleeve soaked in blood from where the dog's teeth had torn through muscle. He groaned, barely able to lift his head. "Boss, we need to get out of here." The leader took half a step back. Jake saw the doubt creeping in, saw the fear settle in the corners of his eyes. But men like him, they didn't back down easy not when they had built their reputations on intimidation. He forced a smirk, straightened his spine. "You think you've won, old man?" His voice was forced, cracking slightly. "You think this mutt makes you untouchable?" Jake tilted his head, pretending to consider it. "No," he said, "but it sure makes you look stupid." A few of the gang members exchanged glances. One of them, tall, bearded, still clutching his busted nose, shuffled back another step. His hands were already up, palms facing out. "I ain't getting ripped apart over this," he muttered. "Screw this, I'm out." Another followed suit, spitting on the ground before turning away. "You always run your mouth too much, boss," he muttered before disappearing into the dark. The leader was losing control. Jake took another step forward. Bandit followed, his paws kicking up dust, his body tense and ready. "Now," Jake said, his voice slow, deliberate, "you're gonna leave your weapons right there in the dirt. You're gonna turn around, and you're gonna walk your sorry asses out of my sight." The leader's hands twitched near his belt. He still had a pistol holstered there, but the look in Jake's eyes told him everything he needed to know. If he reached for it, he wouldn't leave this desert alive. One by one, the remaining men tossed their weapons onto the ground. The last to do it was the leader. He held out for a moment longer, jaw clenched, but there was no fight left in him. He dropped his gun with a dull thud. Jake nodded. "Good, now get out." The gang turned and walked, some limping, some gripping their wounds, their heads down in shame. And just as the leader reached the edge of the highway, Jake called out one last time, "Hey, tough guy." The man froze. Jake smirked. "Next time you see a stray dog, maybe don't laugh." The remaining men snickered at their disgraced leader. His reputation was shot. As the defeated gang disappeared into the night, Jake exhaled, rolling his shoulders before kneeling beside Bandit, ruffling his fur. "Guess I owe you a steak, boy." Bandit wagged his tail. The night was theirs. As the dust settled and the gang disappeared into the night, Jake leaned against his truck, exhaustion finally catching up with him. The adrenaline that had kept him steady was wearing off, leaving behind the weight of what had just happened. He glanced down at Bandit, who stood beside him, his ears perked up, still watching the darkness where the gang had vanished. Jake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Hell of a night," he muttered. Bandit turned his head, panting, as if he understood. Maybe he did. Jake never thought much about fate, about how life throws you into the right place at the right time or the wrong one. But if there was ever a moment that proved things happen for a reason, it was this. A few weeks ago, Bandit had been nothing but a stray, a half-starved mutt scrounging for scraps at a rest stop. People laughed when Jake took him in, called him crazy for feeding a dog that wasn't his, said a stray wasn't worth the trouble. But tonight, that so-called stray had been the only reason Jake was still standing. Funny how that worked. He knelt down, rubbing Bandit's head, feeling the thick fur between his fingers. "They thought you were just some dumb mutt," he said softly. "Guess they didn't know better." Bandit wagged his tail, his tongue lolling out. Jake shook his head, chuckling to himself. Hell, maybe I didn't know better either. He had spent years on the road, keeping to himself, making as few connections as possible. It was easier that way. No strings, no attachments, no goodbyes. But Bandit had changed that. He had reminded Jake of something important. Loyalty isn't just something you give, it's something you earn. Jake stood, stretching, feeling the stiffness in his muscles. He took one last look at the highway, the place where he had nearly lost everything. Then he turned toward his truck, Bandit trotting beside him. As he climbed into the cab, he patted the seat next to him. "Come on, boy, let's get out of here." Bandit hopped in without hesitation, circling once before settling in. Jake started the engine, the familiar rumble steadying him. The world kept moving, and so would he. But he knew one thing for sure: he'd never look at a stray dog the same way again. And maybe, just maybe, he'd stop running from the things that actually mattered. What about you? Have you ever had someone or something stand by your side when no one else did? Have you ever underestimated someone, only to realize they were more than they seemed? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like this story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and stick around for more real-life stories from the road. Some tales are too good to make up.